In the Third Age, there were over a dozen major wars, and dozens more major battles, that we know of. You see, most of our knowledge of Middle-earth is restricted to the Westlands, a mere fraction of the true size of the continent. Beyond the map are the vast regions of Rhun and Harad and whatever other unnamed places that exist, filled with millions of people that we don't even know the names of. These lands had wars of their own, far from the eyes of the elves and the Dunedain. In this video, let's talk about the secret wars of Rhun and Harad. Our only real interactions with Rhun and Harad are as vast exotic lands where Sauron drew the overwhelming majority of his mannish servants, who made up a significant portion of his manpower. We see them as eternal enemies of places like Gondor and Rohan, their eyes always facing westwards, frothing at the mouth to invade whenever they can. And whenever one of their invasions gets defeated, it's easy to assume that they're then spending all of their time preparing for the next one. They're convenient monsters who reside off the screen, who can be pulled onto the page to deal damage whenever they're required. But there's a couple of important things to know about Rhun and Harad. Firstly, these aren't the names of nations, they're just vast regions. Rhun means east and Harad means south. Secondly, the people who live there aren't monolithic. Easterlings and Haradrim or Southrons are just broad terms to describe a number of different peoples. And thirdly, our information about these lands is limited because our in-universe perspective is from a small number of people in the Westlands, most of whom have little to no experience with these lands or their peoples. The last point is important because it means the only time we have decent information about them is when they're attacking the West. But to say that this was their only purpose is completely untrue. Tolkien actually leaves a lot of hints telling us that Rhun and Harad were lands that were alive with different peoples and kingdoms of their own, peoples and kingdoms who would often fight each other, and that Rhun and Harad were just as blood-soaked as some of the lands in the West. Okay, so even in the First Age, Rhun and Harad were not exactly safe, despite most of Morgoth's attention being on the far west of Middle-earth in Beleriand. We're told that when men first awoke, Morgoth or his servants went amongst them and corrupted them. This led to early men oppressing each other, and eventually resulted in several groups of men, later known as the Edain, fleeing into the west. However, those men who worshipped Morgoth were not about to let this happen. They would hunt down the ancestors of the Edain, kill, enslave, and sometimes even sacrifice them. This grim situation seems to have died down as the First Age progressed, and Morgoth could no longer afford to divide his attention. Different groups of men spread out across Middle-earth, some good, some evil, some indifferent to both Morgoth and the Valar alike. Unfortunately, many of these groups still retain some darkness in their hearts from their very earliest days, and this was a problem that would resurface several times in the future. However, another legacy of Morgoth was his Eastern Orcs. These orcs were servants of his before his initial captivity at the hands of the Valar, and after his capture they would remain in the East, masterless and uncontrollable. We're told that these orcs grew powerful due to their independence, they would attack each other, and they would also attack men, regardless of their alignment. Keep in mind, men at the time, especially those in the East, were relatively primitive. They had little experience with war, they crafted weapons from wood, wore little to no armour, and built no stone. They would have been at a huge disadvantage against these orcs, who would have revelled at hunting down such prey. And things didn't get any better come the Second Age. Many of Morgoth's creatures fled east after his defeat. More orcs, trolls, demons, dragons, and other misshapen beasts. But not all of those fleeing were monsters, at least not physically. Men who had served Morgoth during the First Age, such as the original Easterlings, were also fleeing back east after his defeat. Thanks to their interactions and service under Morgoth, these men were more warlike, more advanced, and, most of all, more evil. They came back into the east and subjugated many groups of wandering men who had neither the strength nor knowledge to resist them. In the early years of the Second Age, Sauron took advantage of this, and ended up going far and wide across Rhun and Harad, and even in the west, swaying men to his cause. He found most of his success in Rhun because there were many peoples there who were already more aligned with the darkness, thanks to serving Morgoth or being subjugated by his servants. He would teach them metallurgy, stonework, better equipping them to defend themselves, and he would also eventually end up getting the Eastern Orcs under his control, ending their millennia-long streak of destruction. But Sauron was a tyrant who demanded eternal service, and not all of the men in the East were willing to submit. They might have been crushed if not for the arrival of two more major players, the Blue Wizards, who arrived around 1600 of the Second Age. They raised rebellions against Sauron's dominion in Rhun, robbing him of manpower and dividing his attention at times. At one point, Tolkien actually wrote that the Blue Wizard's actions in the East played a huge role in the survival of the West. As far as we're aware, these wars and rebellions continued into the Third Age, and possibly up to Sauron's final defeat. Most of this took place in Rhun, but Harad was also a battleground for major players during this time. Sauron found less success swaying the Haradrim to him because the Haradrim who dwelt along the coasts were exposed to the Númenóreans, who, in their early days, were quite generous, even freeing many of the Southrons from the yoke of Morgoth's servants. However, after the middle of the Second Age, the Númenóreans also started becoming increasingly tyrannical, and they came to Middle-earth as subjugators rather than friends. As the Second Age progressed, they established powerful colonies along the coasts of Harad, extending far into the south. Sauron was not about to let Númenor dominate Harad, and spent a lot of resources resisting those efforts, leading to constant warfare in the region. In the 28th century, Tar-Kalmakil of Númenor conquered vast lands in Harad, causing Sauron's forces to retreat into the east. However, 400 years later, Sauron was seemingly back in force, and Harad once again became a battleground. It's during these wars where Ar-Pharazôn, the last king of Númenor, earned his fame. During Ar-Pharazôn's reign, Sauron's forces actually started directly attacking Númenor's settlements along the coast, leading to Ar-Pharazôn raising a mighty army and taking Sauron as a prisoner. Sauron's corruption of Númenor and its subsequent downfall actually led to a brief period where most of Rhun and Harad, minus those places controlled by the Blue Wizards, were actually under his control. Sauron would rally the vast forces of these lands, Haradrim, Easterlings, Black Númenóreans, and others, and use them during the War of the Last Alliance. However, Sauron was defeated, and his short-lived dominion came to an end. And it seems to have come to an end violently, because the moment Sauron was gone, his former servants immediately started to kill each other. His most powerful servants, the Black Númenóreans, were the first to go. The former colonies of Númenor immediately started warring with each other, perhaps over who was the true successor to Númenor's legacy. Some of these realms weakened themselves so much through infighting that they were overthrown and conquered by the Haradrim. Others fell due to decadence. At least one, Umbar, was conquered by Gondor. The East was no different. There was a short respite after Sauron's fall, when his most fervent former servants were still reeling from his destruction, but even with Sauron gone, his evil legacy remained, imprinted onto the hearts of these men. Cruel wars started to rage amongst them, and we're told that some of them decided to withdraw west, and instead take out their hatred upon the peoples of these lands instead. It's possible that the first Easterling invasions of Gondor in the 5th and 6th century were one such of these groups. Even as Gondor extended its reach and became a significant threat to the peoples of Rhun and Harad, we're told that they still fought each other. Harad is said to have had numerous kingdoms, evidenced by the fact that after Gondor conquered much of near Harad, they took tribute from various Haradrim kings. These kings seem to have unified against Gondor at times, but at other times they just went straight back to fighting each other. In the 19th century, during the initial Wainrider invasion of Gondor, we're told that Gondor had little worry from its southern border because the kings of Harad were stuck in wars and feuds of their own. Speaking of the Wainriders, they were massive instigators of war, not just with Gondor and Rhovanion, but with other Easterlings and Haradrim too. They're described as a tribe, or confederacy of tribes, but given they split into two groups, the Wainriders of Rhovanion and the Wainriders of Rhun, and given how quickly they collapsed after their last defeat, I get the feeling they were a confederacy of tribes, where a single warlike tribe had dominated all of the others around them. In one of my videos, I compare them to the Huns, who were much the same. Apart from subjugating their fellow tribes, the Wainriders are also said to have attacked southwards into Harad. While the Wainriders of Rhovanion were fighting Gondor, the Wainriders of Rhun were invading the lands of Khand and beyond. These wars ended, and an alliance was signed between the Wainriders and the nearby Haradrim to attack Gondor, specifically because Sauron's emissary stepped in. And once again, it seems like Sauron is the one who brought peace to Rhun and Harad. What a great guy. By uniting them under his tyrannical dominion. Okay, guess not so great. After the Watchful Peace, we don't hear of the Haradrim and the Easterlings fighting each other or amongst themselves, although it undoubtedly would have still happened. Remember, the fight against the Blue Wizards was still going at this time, and the fields of Nirn were tilled by the slaves captured in these wars. But for the most part, their ire seems to have been directed towards Gondor and Rohan. During the Battle of Pelennor Fields, there are Easterlings and Haradrim present that the men of the West had very little experience with, suggesting that Sauron's servants have come from far and wide to destroy the West. But after Sauron's defeat, it's fairly likely that everything fell apart once again in the power vacuum that ensued. Sauron's dominion would have collapsed, there would have been rebellions and infighting, and kingdoms taking advantage of their neighbours' weakness. I talk more about this on my video on the collapse of Sauron's dominion, and it's actually explored in a bunch of Lord of the Rings Online's most recent expansions. In Harad, the Empire of Adark begins to collapse, leading to various rebel realms such as Umbar, Shigana, and Aradun declaring independence. So, although we're familiar with the great wars that take place in the West, the Wars of Beleriand, the War of the Last Alliance, the Angmar Wars, the Wainrider invasion, the War of the Ring, we should also remember that Rhun and Harad saw their fair share of bloodshed. You had the brutal survival horror of the First Age, and the early Second Age against Morgoth's former servants. You had the rebellions of the Blue Wizards that lasted for millennia. You had the forces of Numenor and Sauron using Harad as a battlefield. You had the fall of the Black Númenórean dominions, the infighting amongst the Haradrim, the Wainrider Wars of Conquest, and eventually the aftermath of Sauron's final fall. We get mere glimpses of these wars, and that's why, at least to the Westlands, they feel like a secret. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. If you want to learn more about Rhun and Harad, I have a podcast video on each of those places, detailing their histories from the First Age to the Fourth Age in greater depth. Apart from that, I actually really enjoyed making this video, so I hope you enjoy watching it as well. Cheers, farewell, and remember, there's a secret war happening inside all of us, between two wolves. Both are gay.